Wild Heart. In the depths of the preserved forest of Horizon Ranch, something silent and wild began to move. A jaguar with her cub emerged from the green corridors, forever changing the routine of rancher Frank Wilson. But it was what his horse did that day that no one would ever forget. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know which city you're watching from. We'll continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. The day hadn't even announced its arrival when Frank was already up. The clock showed 4:30 in the morning, a time his body knew as well as the outline of the mountains surrounding Horizon Ranch. His tired steps echoed through the kitchen as he prepared the strong coffee that would accompany him on his first round of the day. The house, too big for just one man, kept in every corner memories of Margaret, who had departed 7 years ago, taken by an illness that consumed her body but never her spirit. Frank observed her photograph on the wall, lightly, touched the frame and smiled melancholically. "Good morning, my flower," he said softly as he did every morning. Then he picked up his time-worn hat, put on his faded plaid shirt and went out to the yard. The dawn chill made him rub his hands, hardened by decades of tough work. At 65, Frank knew every inch of those 500 acres he had inherited from his father, who in turn had received them from his grandfather. 3 generations of men and women who had drawn their livelihood and identity from the land. In the distance, the first mooing of cattle mingled with the song of birds announcing the dawn. Something, however, seemed different that morning. The animals were more agitated than usual. Frank furrowed his brow, feeling a shiver run down his spine that had nothing to do with the morning dew. He mounted Thunder, his spotted horse with shiny coat, faithful companion of so many journeys, and set off to check the fences of the eastern pasture, where the cattle were most restless. Upon arriving there, he discovered the reason. For the 3rd time that week, the fence was damaged, wires broken, and an opening large enough to allow the passage of a medium-sized animal. "What the devil is happening here?" he muttered to himself, dismounting to better examine the damage. On the damp ground, unmistakable footprints marked the mud. They weren't from a dog or a coyote, animals that occasionally appeared around there. The rounded shape and considerable size indicated something larger, more powerful. Frank felt his heart quicken as he crouched to touch the fresh marks. His experienced gaze recognized them. They were jaguar tracks. He stepped back a few paces and noticed deep scratches on the wooden fence posts. They were recent marks made by claws as sharp as knives. Frank swallowed hard. In 50 years working this land, he had never seen a jaguar so close to the ranch house. When he mounted Thunder again, he noticed the animal was nervous, stomping, his hooves on the ground and reluctant to move forward. "Easy, partner," Frank whispered, stroking the horse's neck. But Thunder remained agitated, especially when they pointed toward the dense forest that grew on the western border of the property. The foreman, Joe Small, approached on horseback, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Mr. Wilson, good morning." "Something's wrong happening. The calves have been scared since last night, mooing non-stop." Frank nodded without taking his eyes off the forest. "I know, Small. I think we have uninvited visitors on the ranch. Did you see these marks on the ground and the scratches on the fence? We have a jaguar prowling the property." The foreman's eyes widened. "A jaguar, Mr. Wilson? It's been years since one was seen in these parts. Not since they cut down the big forest on Late Johnson's farm to plant soybeans. The animals disappeared." "Well, this one came back, and judging by the size of the tracks, it's a big animal." Frank spent the rest of the morning reinforcing the fences and instructing the ranch hands to stay alert. The cattle were moved to pastures closer to the ranch house, and night patrols were doubled. Despite the precautions, something in the back of his mind told him that this situation was different. It wasn't just a predator looking for food. There was something else happening. At dusk, he decided to personally check the area near the creek that cut through the property. It was the only place on the ranch where the forest remained practically untouched, preserved at Margaret's insistence, who always said that without clean water, there was no possible life. He dismounted from Thunder and proceeded on foot, silently, among the trees. The sound of running water guided him as he ventured deeper into the small forest, That's when he heard a different sound, a weak meow almost, imperceptible. He approached cautiously and behind a clump of ferns saw a jaguar cub. The animal, which couldn't have been more than 3 months old, was alone, apparently unharmed, but clearly frightened. Frank remained motionless, too surprised to react. The cub raised its golden eyes in his direction but didn't flee. That's when Frank sensed it. He wasn't alone. Someone was watching him. He turned slowly and, about 60 feet away, partially hidden by vegetation, there she was, an adult jaguar, majestic in her golden coat speckled with black spots. The female stared at him fixedly, muscles tense but without advancing. Frank held his breath. He knew he was vulnerable. A sudden movement could provoke an attack, but something in the animal's behavior intrigued him. The jaguar showed no aggression. She observed. She waited, as if she were evaluating. She's protecting her cub, Frank thought. And then something unusual happened. The cub, gaining courage, left its hiding place and walked toward its mother, passing less than 6 feet from where Frank stood. The adult jaguar remained motionless, just following the cub with her gaze until it approached close enough. Frank watched, amazed at this demonstration of trust. The jaguar could have attacked him to protect her offspring, but she chose not to. Instead, when the cub got close to her, she briefly licked it, and both disappeared into the forest, unhurried. That encounter awakened something inside Frank. It wasn't fear nor anger at the possible threat to his cattle. It was a kind of respect, a silent admiration. Those animals weren't there by chance. There was a reason, a necessity. As he walked back to where Thunder was waiting, Frank reflected on what he had just witnessed. The jaguar hadn't attacked, even having all the conditions to do so. There was intelligence in those golden eyes, strategy, and more importantly, maternal care. He mounted again and, instead of heading directly to the ranch house, decided to take a longer route circling the forest area. That's when he noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The vegetation formed a natural corridor connecting his property to the distant mountains, a green path amid a landscape increasingly dominated by monocultures. Upon arriving home with the first stars dotting the sky, Frank sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. His mind was buzzing with questions. Why had the jaguars appeared now? Where did they come from? What were they looking for on his land? The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar and brought a smile to his tired face. "Dad, it's Sarah. I'm calling to let you know I'll arrive there early tomorrow. I have important news to share." Frank smiled at hearing his daughter's voice. Sarah, his only daughter, had followed a very different path from his. At 32, she was a biologist specializing in wildlife, working for an environmental conservation organization. It had been almost 6 months since they had seen each other. "That's great, honey. I have something to tell you too. I think you'll be interested." After hanging up, Frank went back to contemplating the stars. Tomorrow would be an important day, he felt. Sarah's arrival and the appearance of the jaguars couldn't be mere coincidence. Something was about to change at Horizon Ranch. The roar of the Jeep's engine cut through the morning silence at Horizon Ranch. Frank, who had already completed the first round of the day, watched the vehicle approaching along the dirt road that wound between the pastures. He immediately recognized the driver, with her dark hair tied in a ponytail and dark glasses protecting her eyes from the rising sun. Sarah, his daughter, arriving earlier than agreed, as she always did when she was anxious. Upon parking, she jumped out of the Jeep with the agility of someone accustomed to fieldwork. She wore hiking boots, cargo pants full of pockets, and a long-sleeved shirt, despite the heat that was already beginning to build. Frank smiled, noticing that no matter how urban her life had become, Sarah had never lost the practicality learned on the ranch. "Dad," she exclaimed, hugging him tightly, "I've missed you so much." Frank returned the hug, feeling his chest warm. Since Margaret's passing, Sarah had been his only family tie, his deepest connection to the world beyond the ranch fences. "I missed you too, kiddo." "But what's all this?" he asked, pointing to the Jeep loaded with equipment. There were boxes with what appeared to be cameras, tripods, some electronic devices he didn't recognize, and several folders with documents. Sarah smiled, a gleam of enthusiasm in her eyes. "This, Dad, is the reason for my visit. I have a proposal for you, but first I want to hear what you had to tell me. It sounded important on the phone." Frank led his daughter to the porch where Dora, the cook who had worked at the ranch for more than 20 years, had already prepared a hearty breakfast: freshly baked cheese bread, cornbread, fresh fruits picked from the orchard, and strong coffee, just the way they both liked it. As they Frank recounted his encounter with the Jaguars the day before. As he spoke, he noticed how Sarah's face transformed. Her eyes widened, and she dropped the bread she was eating, leaning forward, completely absorbed by the story. "Dad, are you sure? An adult jaguar with a cub? Here on the ranch?" she asked, her voice mixing surprise and excitement. "Absolutely. Saw it with these eyes that will one day return to the earth. Also, the fences on the east pasture have been damaged several times this week. I found footprints and scratches that could only be from a jaguar." Sarah abruptly stood up and ran to the Jeep, returning with a laptop and some folders. She opened the computer on the porch table and began typing frantically. "This explains everything, Dad. This is why I'm here. Look at what we discovered." She turned the screen so Frank could see. It was a map of the region, with green patches representing forest areas amid beige and yellow expanses, which he presumed were agricultural and pasture areas. "This is a vegetation cover mapping we conducted over the last 6 months. See this green line that crosses several properties? It's a natural wildlife corridor, one of the last in the region. And guess where it ends? Right here at Horizon Ranch." Frank frowned, trying to understand. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means, Dad, that your ranch is the last refuge for several species being displaced by agricultural expansion. 2 years ago, Progress Farm, on the other side of the ridge, cleared almost 2,000 acres of native forest to plant soybeans. Last year, St. Lucie Farm to the north did the same. The animals that lived there are being pushed here because this is the last significant fragment of forest connected to the mountains." Frank leaned back in his chair, absorbing that information. So that's why the jaguars had appeared. They didn't have many options. "And what do you propose, Sarah? That I abandon cattle ranching to become a sanctuary for wild animals?" he asked, with a touch of irony in his voice. Sarah smiled, already expecting this reaction. "No, Dad. I propose something better, that you transform part of the ranch into a private natural heritage reserve. You keep the property, continue with the cattle in the already established areas, but formalize the protection of the forested areas. Plus, we can implement an ecotourism project. Just imagine, people paying to visit the ranch, observe the animals, learn about nature." Frank shook his head, skeptical. "Sarah, that's city folk talk. Nobody will pay to see forest and critters. Besides, we're talking about jaguars, dangerous animals. What if they attack someone? And my cattle? I've already lost 2 calves this month." Sarah wasn't deterred by her father's resistance. She opened one of the folders and pulled out some documents, spreading them on the table. "Dad, there are dozens of rural properties in the United States that are adopting this model. Look at these cases, ranches that increased their profitability by combining traditional production with conservation and tourism. As for the cattle, we can implement effective protection measures. And about the jaguars, they rarely attack humans. They're naturally elusive animals." Frank silently leafed through the documents, numbers, graphs, photos of properties that seemed to thrive following the model Sarah was suggesting. Still, decades of traditional mentality didn't dissolve from one hour to the next. "I don't know, honey, that's a lot of change all at once." Sarah sighed, well aware of her father's stubbornness. Then she changed strategy. "Dad, remember Grandma's old trunk in the attic? I brought something for you that I found at my place among the things I took when I moved." She pulled an envelope yellowed with time from her backpack. Inside were old documents and some black and white photographs, dated 1940. Frank carefully took the photos, recognizing in them his grandfather, Augustus, founder of Horizon Ranch. "Look at this, Dad. These are Grandpa Augustus's records. He documented the presence of jaguars, tapirs, and even gray wolves in the region. And see this. She pointed to a handwritten passage in one of the documents. He mentions a traditional migration route that passed through these lands, used by both animals and the indigenous peoples who inhabited the region before colonization. Frank felt a tightness in his chest. He had never seen those documents before. It was as if a piece of his own family's history had been revealed. Your grandfather understood the importance of this place, Dad. It's no coincidence that he preserved the creek forest and the hillsides. He knew the ranch was more than just a piece of land to raise cattle. That hit Frank like a revelation. Suddenly, his land gained a new dimension. It wasn't just a livelihood, a material inheritance. It was part of something bigger, older, and deeper. "I need to think about this, Sarah," he finally said, carefully storing the documents. "Of course, Dad. In the meantime, can I install some camera traps in the area where you saw the jaguars? It would be a unique opportunity to study these animals in their natural habitat." Frank agreed with a nod. They finished their coffee in silence, each immersed in their own thoughts. Hours later, Frank accompanied Sarah along the trail leading to the creek. His daughter carried a backpack with equipment and walked confidently, as if she knew the path by heart, despite not having visited that part of the ranch for years. "I grew up running along these trails," she commented, as if reading her father's thoughts. "Mom always brought me here to watch the birds. I think it was she who planted this passion for nature in me." Frank smiled, remembering Margaret and her love for the ranch. She always said the land was a living being, breathing and speaking through plants, animals, the wind in the leaves. At the time, he thought it was just poetry from a sensitive woman. Now he was beginning to see wisdom in her words. When they reached the area where Frank had encountered the jaguars, Sarah examined the location with trained eyes. She found fur stuck to a bush, footprints partially erased by the previous night's rain, and to her excitement, scratch marks on a tree, typical behavior of jaguars marking territory. "This is incredible, Dad. It's definitely a passage area. I'll install cameras here and at 2 other strategic points. If we're lucky, we'll get amazing images." While Sarah worked, Frank observed his daughter with a mixture of pride and perplexity. How had he not realized it before? The ranch, which for him had always been a business, a family tradition to be maintained, was for Sarah something completely different. A living ecosystem, full of connections and meanings that went far beyond the commercial value of the land. Back at the ranch house, they found Joe Small waiting for them. The foreman looked worried. "Mr. Wilson, the neighbors are talking. Seems like agribusiness folks have their eyes on the lands in this region. They're buying everything that comes up. Dawn Acres, across the river, just sold to a group that wants to expand sugarcane plantations. They're offering a lot of money." Frank and Sarah exchanged glances. The news put everything in a new perspective of urgency. "Thanks for the information, Small," said Frank. "We'll keep an eye out." When they were alone again, Sarah held her father's hands. "Now do you understand why we need to act quickly? If the ranch gets surrounded by monocultures, the wildlife corridor will be cut off for good. Those jaguars you saw will probably be the last ones." Frank nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. It wasn't just about his land, his family legacy. It was something bigger. The days following Sarah's arrival were filled with intense work and changes at Horizon Ranch. Frank, after much reflection, agreed to take the first steps toward transforming part of his land into a reserve. It wasn't an easy decision for a man raised in the tradition of cattle ranching, but his grandfather's documents and the encounter with the jaguars had touched something deep in his heart. The cameras installed by Sarah began to capture surprising images. Besides the jaguar and her cub, they recorded the presence of deer, coyotes, bobcats, and a multitude of birds. The hidden biodiversity on his land was much greater than Frank had ever imagined. One afternoon, while reviewing the images on the house porch, Sarah couldn't contain her emotion as she showed her father a video of the mother jaguar teaching her cub to hunt. "Look at this, Dad. It's extremely rare behavior to document in nature. If we continue this work, we can significantly contribute to scientific research on these animals." Frank observed the images with a mixture of admiration and concern. The grace and strength of the animal were undeniable, but he couldn't help thinking about the challenges ahead. News of his plans had already spread throughout the region, and not everyone received the idea with enthusiasm. That same night, during dinner, they were surprised by the arrival of Jerome Matthews, owner of Progress Farm and one of the largest soybean producers in the region. The stocky man, with a face reddened by the sun and barely contained anger, entered the dining room without ceremony. "Frank, we need to talk. What's this story about turning your ranch into an open-air zoo? Have you lost your mind?" Frank rose calmly, facing his neighbor. He had known Jerome for decades, but they had never exactly been friends. Their views on land use had always been diametrically opposed. "Jerome, this is my daughter Sarah. Sarah, this is Jerome Matthews, our neighbor." Jerome barely looked at Sarah, concentrating, his attention on Frank. "People are saying you're going to stop raising cattle, that you're going to let the forest take over everything. Is that true?" "Not exactly," Frank replied, keeping calm. "We're studying the possibility of creating a reserve on part of the ranch while maintaining cattle ranching in the already established areas." Jerome let out a dry laugh. "And you think, that's going to work? Frank, wake up. Conservation doesn't make a profit, and worse, you're going to attract those environmentalists to the region, people who don't understand anything about land, but want to dictate how we should work." Sarah intervened, her voice firm but polite. "Mr. Matthews, with all due respect, there are several studies showing that integrating agricultural production and conservation is not only possible, but also economically viable. Besides, Horizon Ranch is in a strategic position for maintaining regional biodiversity." Jerome turned to her, his eyes flashing. "Oh, of course. The daughter who studied in the big city and now comes to teach how to work on the ranch. Look, miss, I respect your father, but you don't know what you're talking about. This country needs to produce, not create sanctuaries for animals that only cause damage." Frank stepped forward, placing himself between Jerome and his daughter. "Jerome, you came to my house. You're being received with respect, and I expect you to reciprocate in the same way. What I do or don't do on my land is my business. Now, if you came to talk civilly, feel free to join us for dinner." The man hesitated for a moment, then shook his head. "No, thank you. I just came to warn you. You're buying an unnecessary fight, Frank. And I'm not just talking about me. There are big interests involved in the agricultural development of this region. Think carefully before putting yourself in the way." With these words, he left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving a heavy silence in the dining room. "Was that her threat?" asked Sarah, still stunned by the confrontation. Frank sighed, sitting back down at the table. "More or less. Jerome has strong political connections and represents agribusiness groups that have been trying to expand in this region for years. Our ranch is one of the few that has resisted the pressure to sell or completely convert to monocultures." Little did they know that Jerome's visit was just a prelude to difficult times. The next morning, Frank was surprised by an official notification. An anonymous complaint about environmental irregularities had resulted in a temporary embargo on the sale of his cattle. "This is retaliation, Dad," said Sarah, reading the document with indignation. "They're trying to pressure you economically." Frank nodded, his face serious. The embargo, even if temporary, meant a hard blow to the ranch's finances. Without the regular sale of cattle, it would be difficult to maintain operational costs, pay the employees, and invest in the necessary changes for the reserve project. As if that wasn't enough, news of the embargo spread quickly among the ranch, workers generating anxiety and speculation. Joe Small, the foreman who had been Frank's right-hand man for years, was the first to express his concerns. "Mr. Wilson, the hands are scared. They're saying we're going to stop with the cattle, that everyone's going to lose their jobs. Is that true?" Frank gathered all the employees in the main barn, determined to clarify the situation. "I'll be straight with you. Yes, we're facing challenges. There's a temporary embargo that we're going to contest. And yes, we're planning changes to the ranch, including creating a reserve on part of the land. But that doesn't mean we're abandoning cattle ranching or that you'll lose your jobs." He looked at each of the faces present before continuing. "In fact, we'll need more people, not fewer. Besides the traditional work with cattle, there will be new roles, guides for visitors, forest rangers, personnel for trail maintenance, monitoring of wildlife. All of you will have the opportunity to learn new skills and participate in this project. Joe Small, who until then had maintained a skeptical expression, was the first to speak. Mr. Wilson, I've worked with you for more than 20 years. I know cattle, fences, pasture. I don't know anything about guiding tourists or taking care of wild animals. Frank smiled, placing his hand on the foreman's shoulder. And I know you, Small. I know there's no one who knows this land better. Who else could tell the stories of this ranch to visitors? Who else would know the best locations for animal observation? You don't need to abandon what you know. Just add new knowledge. Gradually, the initial resistance began to give way to curiosity. Frank and Sarah proposed a period of gradual transition, during which traditional work with cattle would continue normally, while new activities would be implemented little by little. Sarah brought to the ranch a team of biologists and university students who, besides conducting research on local fauna, offered training to the employees. Joe Small, initially the most resistant, surprisingly became one of the most enthusiastic learners, especially after Sarah put him in charge of monitoring the cameras on the creek trail. It was he who, 2 weeks later, came running to the main house with exciting news. Mr. Wilson, Ms. Sarah, come see what we captured on camera 3. The images showed something unexpected, a second adult feline. This time a large male cautiously approaching the area where the female and the cub had been regularly seen. "It's an adult male!" exclaimed Sarah, studying the images with enthusiasm. "Probably the cub's father. This is extraordinary. Jaguar families rarely stay together. The fact that he found his way here following the female and the cub proves the importance of this wildlife corridor." Frank observed the images with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "2 adults mean a greater risk for the cattle," he commented. Sarah nodded, understanding her father's concern. "Yes, but it also means we can implement a more comprehensive management plan. We'll reinforce the protections for the cattle and at the same time ensure the jaguars have access to sufficient natural prey in the reserve area." In the days that followed, they recorded several encounters between the male and the female, always at a safe distance from the cub. To everyone's surprise, there were no confrontations. The male seemed to respect the female's space, approaching only when permitted, maintaining a respectful distance from the cub. "It's like a dance," commented Dora, the cook, who had also become fascinated by the images. "They know exactly how to behave without needing anyone to teach them." Frank, observing the interaction between the felines, couldn't help but think about the ancestral wisdom of those animals. They had found a way to coexist, to share territory without unnecessary conflicts. There was something to be learned there. Meanwhile, external pressure continued to increase. The embargo, although legally contested by Sarah with the help of lawyers specializing in environmental law, persisted. Some suppliers, pressured by the big producers in the region, began to make it difficult to sell inputs to Horizon Ranch. Malicious rumors circulated in neighboring towns. They said Frank had gone crazy, that he was abandoning decades of family tradition due to the influence of his eco-freak daughter. The last straw came when Councilman Claude Ferris, known for representing agribusiness interests in the region, convened a public hearing to discuss the negative economic impacts of creating private reserves in the county. "They're trying to mobilize public opinion against us," explained Sarah, showing her father the hearing notice published in the local newspaper. "They'll argue that the reserve harms the region's economic development, that it reduces job creation and tax collection." Frank felt the weight of that battle on his shoulders. He had never been a man of politics or public speeches. He had always preferred the silent work of dealing with the land, away from the spotlight and controversies. "And what can we do?" he asked, suddenly feeling tired. Sarah smiled, firmly holding her father's hands. "We can show the truth, Dad. We can prove that it's possible to reconcile production and conservation. That Horizon Ranch isn't stopping production, just producing differently, more sustainably. And that, in the long run, this will benefit the entire region." Frank nodded, slowly. He knew it wouldn't be easy. that they would face resistance from all sides. But looking into his daughter's determined eyes, so similar to Margaret's, he felt a certainty growing inside him. They were on the right path. That night, alone on the porch, Frank observed the full moon illuminating the pastures and the distant forest. Somewhere in that darkness, the Jaguars continued their lives, oblivious to the human disputes that would decide their fate. He made a silent promise to the stars. He would not allow that ancestral connection between his land and nature to be broken. Not in his time, not under his watch. The town hall had never been so full. Farmers from the region, local merchants, university students, environmentalists, and curious onlookers packed the space for the public hearing that would discuss the future of Horizon Ranch, and by extension the rural development model that would prevail in the region. Frank, sitting in the front row next to Sarah, felt out of place. He wore his best shirt, his grey hair carefully combed, but his calloused hands betrayed his true identity, a man of the land, not of words or public debates. Councilman Claude Ferris opened the session with an inflammatory speech about progress and economic development. We are here today to discuss an issue that affects the future of our region. The proposal to transform part of Horizon Ranch into an environmental reserve represents a setback for our economy. We need more production, more jobs, more development. We cannot allow urban ideologies to dictate how we should use our lands. Enthusiastic applause came from a group of farmers led by Jerome Matthews, who smiled with satisfaction. Next, various experts aligned with agribusiness presented graphs and statistics, attempting to demonstrate how creating reserves would reduce the region's agricultural productivity and, consequently, wealth generation. When it was Sarah's turn, she approached the podium with confidence. She presented data on the ecological importance of the corridor that passed through Horizon Ranch, explained how biological diversity contributed to soil and water resources health, and showed examples of rural properties that had increased their profitability by integrating traditional production and environmental conservation. The real choice we face is not between production or conservation, but between a short-term development model that depletes natural resources or a sustainable model that ensures productivity and quality of life for future generations, she concluded. Her technical arguments were received with applause from students and environmentalists present, but also with skeptical expressions from many rural producers. The division in the room was evident. Then, to everyone's surprise, including Sarah's, Frank stood up and walked slowly to the podium. He hadn't prepared any speech, but he felt he needed to speak, with his own words and experience. "My name is Frank Wilson," he began, his rough voice echoing through the microphone. "I've been a rancher for more than 50 years. I inherited Horizon Ranch from my father, who received it from my grandfather. 3 generations of my family have lived and worked on that land." He paused, looking directly at the audience. "I'm not an environmentalist. I don't have a university degree. I'm just a man who has learned to love and respect the land that sustains him." Frank then recounted his encounter with the Jaguars, the discovery of his grandfather's documents, and the growing perception that his ranch was part of something bigger, older, and more important than he had ever imagined. When I saw that, Jaguar looking at me, protecting her cub without attacking me, I understood something that perhaps I had forgotten over the years. We are not owners of the land. We are just its temporary guardians. His voice faltered slightly as he mentioned Margaret and how she had always insisted on preserving the forest around the creek, even when it seemed more profitable to clear it to increase pasture area. "My wife used to say that clean water is more valuable than money. At the time I thought it was just sentimentalism. Today I understand it was wisdom." Frank then explained how he intended to transform Horizon Ranch, maintaining cattle ranching in a rotational system in the already established areas, reforesting degraded areas to strengthen the wildlife corridor, and gradually implementing ecotourism and environmental education activities. "I'm not abandoning production, I'm adapting it to new times, and I believe that in the long run, this will not only preserve nature, but also ensure the economic viability of the ranch for future generations." He finished by looking directly at Jerome and the other farmers. "I respect those who think differently. Everyone takes care of what's theirs as they see fit. I just ask for the same respect to make my choices. Horizon Ranch isn't just a business for me. It's my home, my history, my legacy. And I want to leave a legacy of balance, not destruction." When he finished, a deep silence took over the hall. Then, to everyone's surprise, Mrs. Willow, a 70-year-old lady who had worked as a midwife in the region for decades, stood up and began to applaud. Others followed, and soon a large part of the audience was standing, applauding Frank's simple but powerful speech. Councilman Claude, visibly displeased, closed the hearing by announcing that the County Council would analyze all the information presented before issuing any official position on the issue. As they left the venue, Frank was approached by various local residents, some offering support, others simply curious about the project. Among them was Michael Sanders, the principal of the local school, who proposed a partnership to bring his students for educational visits to the ranch once the project was implemented. "You gave a lesson in citizenship today, Mr. Wilson," commented the teacher. "You did more for environmental education in 10 minutes than many official campaigns achieve in years." In the months that followed, Horizon Ranch underwent a gradual transformation. The embargo on cattle sales was finally lifted after Sarah proved the complaints were unfounded. External resistance continued, especially from Jerome and his allies, but local public opinion after the hearing and increasing positive coverage in regional media tended to favor the project. The process for official recognition of the private Natural Heritage Reserve was slowly advancing through federal bureaucracy. Meanwhile, Sarah and Frank didn't waste time. With the help of biologists, forest engineers, and the ranch employees themselves, they began to implement the planned changes. The forest area was strategically fenced, not to prevent the passage of animals, but to control cattle access. A rotational grazing system was implemented, allowing areas to rest and recover naturally. Seedlings of native species were planted in degraded areas, strengthening the wildlife corridor. Joe Small, who had initially been the most skeptical about the changes, surprised everyone by becoming the most enthusiastic defender of the project. He assumed the role of chief guide for the first groups of visitors, mainly university students and researchers interested in studying the local fauna. "You should have seen the students' faces when I showed them the Jaguar images from the cameras," he excitedly told Frank. "They were speechless. And when I told the stories of the ranch from your grandfather's time, they were even more interested. I think I have a knack for this, Mr. Wilson." Dora, the cook, transformed the ranch's traditional garden into an organic agriculture project, incorporating permaculture techniques learned from the students who frequented the property. Her dishes, prepared with fresh ingredients harvested right there, became a separate attraction for visitors. Sarah divided her time between the ranch and the capital, where she coordinated partnerships with universities, NGOs, and government agencies. Her work at Horizon Ranch began to gain national recognition, and she was invited to share the experience at congresses and events on conservation and sustainable development. 1 year after the public hearing, the news everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The forested area of Horizon Ranch was officially recognized as a private natural heritage reserve. The celebration brought together employees, researchers, students, and even some neighboring farmers who, inspired by the project's success, were beginning to consider similar initiatives on their properties. Frank observed everything with a mixture of pride and amazement. The ranch he had known all his life now pulsed with renewed energy. The visitors' center, built using sustainable techniques, welcomed school groups, tourists, and researchers. Interpretive trails cut through the forest, allowing animal observation, without disturbing them. The old barn had been transformed into an environmental education center, where workshops and lectures were held. The Jaguars, which had been the catalyst for all that transformation, continued to inhabit the property. The cameras regularly recorded their movements, and researchers were able to document behaviors never before observed in a natural state. The cub had grown, becoming a healthy juvenile that was beginning to explore the territory on its own. Not everything, however, was rosy. A fire, apparently arson, hit a reforested area at the ranch boundaries during the dry season. Thanks to the quick mobilization of employees and neighbors, the fire was contained before causing irreparable damage. The episode, although traumatic, served to further strengthen the sense of community around the project. On a Sunday morning, Frank walked alone along one of the trails that bordered the creek. The sun filtered through the leaves, creating golden patterns on the forest floor. He sat on a fallen log and closed his eyes, just listening. The murmur of water, the singing of birds, the gentle wind in the leaves. A presence made him open his eyes. Less than 60 feet away, standing at the edge of the creek, was she, the female Jaguar. The animal stared at him for a few seconds, showing neither fear nor aggression. Then, with elegant movements, she crossed the creek and disappeared into the vegetation on the other side. Frank smiled, feeling a deep peace. He didn't need cameras or scientific studies to understand what had just happened. It was a meeting between equals, a mutual recognition, a silent pact between guardians of the same territory. When he returned to the ranch house, he found Sarah animatedly talking on the phone. After hanging up, she ran to her father, her eyes shining with excitement. "Dad, you won't believe it. Horizon Ranch has been selected as a model for a national program integrating rural production and conservation. They want to implement similar projects in all regions of the country, and I've been invited to coordinate the initiative." Frank hugged his daughter, sharing her joy. What had begun as a threat, the appearance of jaguars, damage to fences, fear for the cattle, had transformed into the greatest purpose of their lives. That night, a special report about Horizon Ranch aired on a nationally broadcast television program. Frank watched, surrounded by employees and friends, as the story of the property's transformation was told to millions of Americans. The images of the jaguars, captured by the ranch's cameras, caused a sensation. The account of how a traditional rancher had found a new path, reconciling production and conservation, inspired hope. "I never imagined seeing my face on television," commented Frank, between shyness and pride. "Well, get used to it," laughed Sarah. "This is just the first of many reports. What we're doing here is important, Dad. It's an example that can help change the mentality of the entire country." As the report ended, the camera showed an aerial view of Horizon Ranch, the main house, the well-tended pastures, the healthy cattle, and in the background, the preserved forest extending to the horizon, a corridor of life connecting past, present, and future. Frank looked at that image and saw not just his property, but his true legacy. It wasn't the size of the herd or the commercial value of the land that would define his success as guardian of that piece of America. It was the balance achieved, the harmony restored, the respect regained between man and nature. Out there, under the starry sky, the jaguars followed their ancestral path, now protected, and Frank knew that, as long as they were there, something fundamental remained intact in this world. Something that no economic development could buy or replace, the integrity of the web of life, of which all humans, jaguars, trees, and waters are a part. The end, dear listeners. We hope that Frank and Sarah's story has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of emotions and reflections, we've prepared a special playlist with equally captivating stories. Find it by clicking on the left. If you enjoyed this story of transformation and respect for nature, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and make us reflect on our place in the world. Don't miss our upcoming